Good evening, everyone. Before we start tonight's discussion, I would like to acknowledge this country and the traditional custodians, the Turrbal and the Yugara people on which we gather here today. We pay our respect to their elders past, present, and recognize the continuing connection to the land, waters, and culture. We extend our respect to the indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders peoples who have cared for this land for thousands of years. My name is Christoph Nedipil-Wang. I am the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and I would like to thank all of you for coming out tonight for, I think, what promises to be a fantastic discussion. And I also would like to extend my gratitude to the Queensland Gallery of Modern Arts for supporting our Perspectives Asia events for 19 years. We're approaching our 20th year anniversary, so very, very long-standing, great cooperation and full of great events like tonight's. Now, I'm really excited about tonight's event. We have a beautiful panel, we have a beautiful audience, but even more because we have a really interesting book. For those who have not had a chance to read it, it's absolutely worth reading. It's full of, I think, very good scholarship and thought leadership on climate politics in Oceania. I read it. Not every page, I must admit. It's a lot of pages. But I found it extremely insightful, not only to understand what needs to be done, but also where we are coming from. And a lot of the leadership that has been shown from Pacific countries to drive global climate action. And the community that has evolved around this. It's also very interesting to see, for me as somebody who's come to Australia 8 months ago only, what the relationship between a lot of the Pacific Islands and Australia is and could look like, and how we can really move forward to address some of the, and potentially the most urgent challenge of humanity, which is climate change. So I'm extremely grateful and happy and excited for tonight's panel. I think I will quickly do a round of introduction, or Tess, let me do it then. So we have Sue Harris-Rimmer, who's from Griffith University. She brought also her family, so very warm welcome. She's a human rights, I think, and climate adaptation scholar, activist, expert. She's the director of the Policy Innovation Hub, brings her experience as a human rights lawyer and policy specialist. So she really does not only teach, but she's also the founder of Every Gen Coalition, advocating for legislative measures to safeguard the rights of our future generations in Australia and I think beyond. We have Mary Merzelina Harm, a proud Samoan, Chinese Fijian, is that correct? Raised in Brisbane, so really multicultural, deeply passionate about using storytelling for social change. She works across multidisciplinary fields, particularly with the youth, collaborates to co-design initiatives benefiting communities. She's the founder of Future Ancestors program that empowers young Pacifica individuals in politics and serves as the Queensland coordinator for the Pacific Climate Warriors, a group of young community leaders. We have Wesley Morgan. He's a research fellow at the Griffith Asia Institute and a senior researcher at the Climate Council of Australia, with also years of experience working in the Pacific Islands. He spent at least a decade in working and living in the region, taught international relations at the University of South Pacific, and served as Pacific policy advisor with Oxfam. And finally, on the stage, we have my esteemed colleague, Professor Tess Newton-Kane. I think pretty much everybody knows everyone here anyway, I think. But Tess is similarly a seasoned Pacific policy expert with over 25 years. It's hard to see because she looks so young. 25 years experience in the region, dual citizenship. Everybody knows Tess. Which dual citizenship does she have? Vanuatu and? Not Australia, it's the UK. She served as lecturer in law at the University of South Pacific and currently leads the Pacific Hub at the Griffith Asia Institute. And she works in climate defense diplomacy, climate, and led studies on China's engagement with the Pacific Islands. So really exciting to have you all here. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you to the audience for coming, and we look forward to our discussion today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm Sue Harris-Rimmer. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Christoph. And I too would like to pay my respects to the Jagera and Turrbal people. And I always also think about the Wiradjuri people from my land and the Warrumbungals and Coonabarabran that have shaped my thinking about the world. So I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's that worldview, that idea of thinking about the rights of many generations to come, the idea of caring for country, the idea of a different attitude to how economics is meant to serve human beings, attitudes to neighbours, attitudes to hospitality. All of those types of First Nations ideas try to infuse our work on climate change, and they hold a lot in common with our Pacific neighbours' traditional ideas and cultures. So we genuinely try to listen and learn from those cultures. So my job is to tell you a little bit about the Climate Action Beacon and how this book and a few other projects have come into being to sort of situate the book for you. So very amazing thing happened a few years ago when Griffith decided to make a strategic investment in research that would serve societal change. So I know most of you are thinking, doesn't all research do that? Oh, I wish. But this one was very specifically an investment into interdisciplinary research. And the first one of those, there's three. There's disrupting violence. There's another one called Inclusive Futures, which is about the rights of people with disability. And the first one, which is about climate action. It's led by Professor Brendan Mackey, and there's a group of 70 researchers that have been working now for 3.5 years on thinking about ways to take climate action. So it's got two parts. First part is around helping organisations change. So it's a sort of an applied outfit called the Climate Ready Initiative. And then the second part is a research part. It's got 3 bits, of course, because that's what academics are like. So the first one's about motivating climate action, and that's a huge longitudinal survey of Australian attitudes on climate change, and what motivates individuals in Australia to take climate action. And unfortunately, that survey has shown over time that people think climate change is a future problem, way away, not something urgent now, unfortunately. So that probably explains why we have the politics that we do at the moment. The second piece is around climate transition. So it's really helping sectors, industries, organisations, including our own university, think about how to be a net zero organisation and what that really means. The third part is the part I lead and where this all comes in, which is about climate justice. So it's thinking about all the deep layers of injustice around climate change. So that is about the idea at its heart that the poorest countries, the countries who were not part of the Industrial Revolution, countries that embraced other ways of thinking, are the ones who are being most impacted by climate change caused by European and American industry, those big industrial impacts. So there's a deep injustice there. There's a temporal injustice, the idea that young people now and people yet to be born are the ones that are going to be most impacted by decisions made by people who were alive and our immediate forebears. There's also the idea that within countries there are injustices. So, for example, as Queenslanders, our Torres Strait Islanders are facing threats to their right to life that they should not have to face as Australian citizens, for example. So there's lots of layers of injustice. And then there's other things about what happens to mining workers and what happens to their way of life when, we have to inevitably change from fossil fuels. So there's layers of injustice around the transition and adaptation measures as well, although they tend to be talked about a bit more So part of what this was about is this idea that we wanted to think about injustices at home where we live and try and tackle those and help our own communities here in Queensland. And we want to feel very connected to our region. So we wanted to genuinely think about how Australia could be in solidarity in climate justice with our Pacific neighbours. And what would that even look like, and where would we even start? So Wes is going to tell you a bit more about the book, but I just wanted to sort of situate the piece. So I'll just tell you about where it all sits. So we've got a few aspects of which this book is one really important pillar. So it wasn't just about producing a piece of work, it's meant to be a manifesto to help the Australian government change. So it's pretty overtly trying to reform the Australian government's way of thinking and working, and it was started before the previous election, so it started way back in late 2021. And of course has shifted a little bit as time has gone on. There's also another piece of work which is a Nature Journal Climate Action special issue, which is called Geographies of Climate Justice in Oceania, which is kind of pairing Pacific Islander voices and practitioner voices as well as academic voices with Australian and New Zealand voices to try and influence the world of science and climate scholarship. So you've got all these humanities and creative people publishing in a nature science journal. It was wild, but it's happened. And that's going to be launched in July. And a free, and that's all open access and freely available. And my favourite piece in that is called Picking Fruit is Not Climate Justice, which is all based on a quote from a Queensland politician who said that climate justice could just equal fruit picking in rural Queensland. The other piece of work is around thinking about communities in Queensland that are vulnerable to climate impacts. So even though we're all think of COVID, we're all vulnerable to COVID, but some of us are going to experience that those impacts more than others. So like COVID, our elderly are more prone to difficult impacts from heat, for example, extreme heat. So morbidity and mortality for the over 80s and over 75s is far higher because of extreme heat. And I'm so excited to see you today because there was a massive decision in the European Court of Human Rights. Yesterday I did this wildly excited podcast, if you're interested, about these beautiful Swiss grandmas who took on Switzerland and said, you have not set credible climate targets. That has made us more susceptible to dying in a heat wave. We're taking you to the European Court of Human Rights. It's the first really important, and they've won. It's the first really important binding human rights decision of that nature. So it's really exciting. So we were also involved in young people who were also taking their states to court. That one didn't get up because of a procedural issue. And there was also a French mayor who was trying to get a flooding case up, but he didn't also succeed for procedural reasons. But the grandmas did. So we now have this really amazing precedent. So it's a good day. It's a day where things are starting to change. And one of the pieces of work we're doing is around this link between extreme heat and human rights. We're also looking at the ethics of climate protest, which is why I'm so obsessed with the Pacific Climate Warriors and the kind of creative, amazing protests they do. But in a time of existential threat, what type of protests should we be engaging with? What should it look like? What kind of defences should there be? What should it look, when is the time when Wes and I are going to chain ourselves to something? It's pretty soon, actually, I think. VC listening? Nope, she wasn't. Good. We're doing a piece of work on what becomes of people who are uninsurable, and that's going to be so many Australians and many people in the Pacific neighbourhood as well. We're thinking about climate mobility, which of course impacts a lot of our Pacific neighbours, but also is going to be impacting our colleagues in Southeast Asia and also our own country, including, as I said, members of the Torres Strait, whose islands are already being heavily affected. And we're also looking at what urban climate justice looks like. So what does it look like to promote climate justice in our cities? So the mission of all this work is for us to think more deeply around climate justice. My own chapter in this book is really looking at the way the Pacific Island leaders and citizens have shaped international human rights law in a very active and creative way, thinking about, they've created very pivotal in creating a special envoy for climate change and human rights. They have thought about a right to a clean and healthy environment, which has now been accepted by the Human Rights Council. They have made strategic complaints to various human rights committees that are bearing fruit now, including the first climate refugee complaint around New Zealand. So they are actively, and a group of students from the University of South Pacific have succeeded in their quest to have the International Court of Justice consider or create an advisory opinion about the impact of climate change on small island states. And it's extraordinary. So my chapter is about extolling Australian diplomats and those involved in international human rights law to be braver and more focused on our ways that we can support our Pacific Island neighbours in their creativity, but also to be more bold and creative ourselves in trying to shape international human rights law so that it serves us in this time of climate need. So that's how this book started. Now I'm going to hand over to Wes to give you a bit more detail on what's in it. What's in the book?
Thanks, Sue. I don't know how to change the slides, but
Sorry, I think we just whistle
it
some.
It doesn't matter. I can talk to it in any case, because to tell the same story but from another angle, perhaps, in 2020 there was an issue of the conservative US foreign policy magazine called Foreign Affairs, which talked about climate change. And, the US foreign policy establishment talks to itself about how they will manage the world in the United States' interests. And they had this, so they're not raving hippies. This was a very conservative foreign policy magazine that was talking about how do we design global climate action in such a way that we actually succeed in tackling the climate crisis, and how does the United States, in a very hard-headed way, pursue its interests with regards to the climate crisis. And we thought, where is the thinking in Australia that is doing the same, that is really thinking about the climate crisis and what it means for Australia's pursuit of its interests in the world? Because the climate crisis changes everything, and some of us just don't know that yet. But for Australia's foreign policy, it impacts our national security, our defence, our relations with key allies, our exports. Our biggest exports are coal, gas, iron ore. It's all going to have to change in a world that is changing in response to the climate crisis. And for our relations in our region, in the Pacific, the climate crisis is the most important issue for Pacific Island countries. And so I think that's the most important contribution of this book, is it begins to do some of the deep thinking about how the climate crisis changes Australia's approach to foreign policy, diplomacy, reimagining how we think about our national security, and reimagining how we think about our relations in the region. And so, honestly, we wouldn't do it justice to read through each of the chapter contributions, but it has quite diverse contributors, including, defence and strategic folk, because, with regards to defence and national security, Australia's national security community struggles to think about climate change. They're so used to thinking about threats to national security coming across the border, or, being traditional kinetic war or terrorism. What is this global climate crisis? That's not a national security issue. But increasingly there is a realisation that it is. More than half of the Australian Defence Force has been deployed to respond to bushfires and floods in the last 4 years. So, you can pretend it's not a national security issue, but it bloody is. And anyway, so I won't do it justice. You just have to... There's Brendan Sargent and Mark Beeson who talk about climate change and national security. But I wanted to give you a flavour that it tries to begin to grapple with how climate change shapes our foreign policy and national security and diplomacy. And I wanted to briefly give you a flavour of the chapter that I contribute in the book, which I do with two co-authors, with Dr. George Carter, who's at ANU, and Filori Manoa, who's at the University of the South Pacific. And we explore Pacific climate leadership, so Pacific Islands in the UN climate talks specifically. And George, he did his doctorate on Pacific Islands in global climate negotiations. Filori did her master's on Pacific Islands at the United Nations in New York, Pacific Island diplomats. And I did my doctorate on Pacific Islands in global trade negotiations. So it was the chapter draws on this real field research that the three of us did to try and it steps out a history of Pacific Island countries in global climate talks. And the Pacific, a global consensus, scientific consensus on climate change emerged in the mid-1980s, and very quickly thereafter, countries in the Pacific realised that climate change presents an existential threat, particularly for low-lying atoll nations like the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, that consist almost wholly of atoll states that barely rise a few metres above sea level. And so, very early, Pacific Island countries, their leaders, together with the Australian Prime Ministers, were issuing declarations that climate change is a threat to their survival, and that in response, because climate change is fundamentally a global problem and can only be solved through global cooperation. So what was needed is a global treaty to reduce emissions, to move away from fossil fuels. And Pacific Island countries have been championing global efforts towards a workable global means of cooperation for the 30 years that we've had UN climate talks, because they have realised that it's so fundamental to their interests. But Pacific Island countries are not victims of climate change. Pacific Island countries have really shaped global cooperation. They've been far ahead of nations like Australia, right, in terms of their global leadership. So, for example, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was first put forward by Nauru on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. I won't try and do the whole chapter justice, but there's one little story that I think is very, very illustrative, which is the role that the Marshall Islands played in the negotiations for the 2015 Paris Agreement. So after 25 years of global climate negotiations, there was a big north-south divide in the discussion about climate change. Wealthy nations have caused the crisis. Poorer nations are often at the front of bearing the brunt of the consequences. So how do you design a response that takes into account those differences? And year after year, the talks got bogged down on these differences. The Marshall Islands, Tony de Brum, the late Tony de Brum, the foreign minister for the Marshall Islands, stitched together, and the book is dedicated to Tony de Brum, yes. He quietly and carefully stitched together a coalition of states across the north-south divide, wealthy nations and poorer nations, who could find common ground that could form the basis for consensus. So for a global treaty, we need nearly 200 nations to agree to it. So finding a landing zone was, that's why it took 25 years. But they met in secret on the sides of the UN General Assembly meetings. They kept all their records by hand because they didn't want to be spied upon by others. And they carefully built a small coalition. And then over time that grew, and they invited all Pacific nations, other island nations. In the end, they invited the African and Caribbean group, and then the European Union joined, and then the United States joined. This was in Paris during the Paris talks, and they became out publicly halfway through the Paris talks, which were crucial talks for landing a global climate treaty. And Tony de Brum is in this picture at the plenary at the end of 2 weeks of negotiations in Paris, and he walked down with the representatives of 200 other countries, and next to him is the US lead negotiator, Todd Stern, and you might see that on their shirts they have bandana sleeves, these little pandanus brooches that have been woven by the women who were part of the Marshall Islands delegation. And if you were wearing one of those, it showed the other negotiators that you were part of the High Ambition Coalition. And, you know, this for me is really illustrative that Pacific Island countries, they don't have guns and treasure, but they have been pursued this for decades with creative diplomacy and have exerted power in such a way that we might not have the Paris Agreement if it wasn't for the leadership and creative diplomacy of Pacific Island countries. And now, today, we have a global consensus that all economies must move towards net zero emissions by the middle of this century. And it's a long story, but we are, the curve is bending, we are going to get there, and we do have the leadership of Pacific Island countries to thank for that. So I'm not very good at timekeeping. I better wind up, but that's a little slice from the book.
Okay, the chapter that I contributed to, which was also co-authored with Melody Ruitt and Caitlin Byrne, who are both from Griffith, and Romitesh Kant, who is a PhD scholar at ANU, previously in a teaching role at USP. So our chapter is quite differs from some of the others in it's got quite a narrow focus. So what we looked at in our chapter was a particular aspect of how China's role in the region is considered, largely because we felt it was not considered. So at the time that we did this work, there was a lot of talk about China's participation in the region as a development partner, as an infrastructure partner. There were obviously concerns from places like Washington, Canberra, Wellington, to an extent, about what China's ambitions were in terms of a security arrangement and what this all meant. Some people were saying that Pacific Island countries were being lured into some kind of debt distress shakedown that was going to see them having to hand over assets to China because they couldn't service loans. So all of these things were very high in the mix when it came to talking about China, but what wasn't in the mix was where did China sit in terms of climate change? So what was the perception of Pacific Island leaders and Pacific Island communities about China when it came to climate change, having established in 2018 under the Boy Declaration that this was the preeminent security threat for the region. So we looked at this from a number of different angles, and we spoke to a range of people across a number of countries. We did have to do this research by remote because we were still very much in the COVID era, so we weren't able to go to places like Vanuatu and Samoa and Solomon Islands, but we did speak to people from those countries, and we also spoke to people that work in regional spaces. And what we were trying to establish was, does the way China engages in relation to climate change, to what extent does that or does that not align with Pacific priorities when it comes to this issue? So the chapter, takes you through who we spoke to, some of the issues we had to deal with, about getting people to talk to us and why we think that was difficult. and also identifies a number of different themes that come out of what we were told by the people that we spoke to. And there's a number, I think the kind of the headline title is Climate Conversations and Disconnected Discourses, because there were a number of disconnects that came out of the material that we gathered. So one of the disconnects is between what happens at regional level and what happens at national level. And this isn't limited to climate change. Wes and I have talked about this on many occasions. There are these amazing conversations that happen in Suva within the confines of regional organisations that have no bearing on what happens in national government conversations in places like Apia or Port Vila. But when it comes to the climate change situation, when we spoke to regional officials, they said to us, every conversation we have is about climate change. So everything starts and ends with climate change. So when we talk to China about engaging with the region, we are talking about climate change. But they felt that those conversations, those engagements were quite minimal, and that largely reflects China's modalities in the region at that time, which were very much focused on bilateral relations rather than multilateral relations. One of the things I would say about our chapter, and I think it would apply across the board, is that things have changed quite a bit since we did the work for this book. So, you know, there's an interesting conversation to be had about what's happened since it went into print, because certainly in the space that we looked at, there have been some significant developments. So generally, when Chinese officials, diplomats, contractors, all of these people are talking with Pacific Islanders, they're talking at national level. So when we spoke to people in country, and we spoke to people in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Samoa, Vanuatu, I think that was it, and then at the regional level. There was also a disconnect. So the disconnect there was between people who work in civil society and activist organisations, some of whom will be Mary's collaborators, who see climate change as being very important. It's very much at the forefront of their thinking. That's what they want major conversations to be about, whether it's about infrastructure or investment or whatever else. And the conversations that were being had by national leaders, predominantly politicians, and there's a whole bunch of work done by other people about why it's politicians rather than bureaucrats, but it is predominantly politicians that are having conversations about investment in their countries. And those conversations are very much around economic development, and they're often around hard infrastructure. So they're around things like ports, bridges, roads. The Chinese, there is a Chinese saying that, if you want to grow rich, you build a road first. And there's no doubt, there's no question in anyone's mind that the infrastructure deficit in the Pacific is huge, has been for quite some time, and continues to be, notwithstanding recent investments that have been. So what seemed to come out of that was that if the Pacific negotiators or the Pacific participants in those conversations raised the issue of climate change, then there would be a response from the Chinese side when they were discussing particular investments or particular projects. And generally that response would be quite positive. So we heard examples of where people had said, they were building a road, and we said to them, this is going to have to be done differently because the road's going to wash out because of the way, where it is or where it is in relation to the water source. And so that was accommodated, and the road was redone, dug up, rebuilt in a way that would make it more climate-proof. But if the Pacific participants didn't raise this, it wasn't necessarily something that the Chinese side would raise of their own accord. So that, I think, is a really interesting and important point for Pacific communities, Pacific activists, Pacific scholars and thinkers to think about how they can increasingly and possibly better influence their own political representatives to be bringing these issues into these conversations. One of the other things that we did was we kind of road tested the sense in which Pacific communities, Pacific people saw China as a climate ally. And what came out of that was that they saw there was a huge potential for China to be an ally of that sort, particularly around things like technology transfer and providing scholarships for students to work in relevant science and technical areas, whether it's weather forecasting, geoengineering, and all of those sorts of things. So if you're going to pick up a copy of the book, I hope you will, I hope you'll engage with that chapter and that it will add to your understanding of some of these critical conversations that are going on in our region.
Talofa, Nisambula Vanaka, and warmest Pacific greetings. My name is Mary Marcelina Harm, and I greet you with my full name because although to the human eye I may be one person here, I come with a village behind me. I too want to acknowledge country. I want to acknowledge the land, waterways, and skies here have always been enriched by community, by storytelling, and by connection. And in that spirit, I also want to acknowledge the interwoven history between Pacifica people and First Nations people, in particular in this part of so-called Australia. Thank you for having me. This book, I don't read, by the way, but I read this book. And for me, this was a story that celebrated Pacifica leadership. So I thank you for seeing us in that light, because for so long, the Pacific has been viewed as the poor victim of climate change, the poor neighbour of Australia. And this book very much celebrates the leadership of the Pacific, so I thank you for that. Most recently, I was asked by someone, what is the importance of storytelling in this time, in this energy transition space? And for me, I was really reflecting on that, and I thought, how do I explain that deep spiritual connection I feel to place to those who will never get it? And by those who will never get it, I mean the fossil fuel industry. How do I explain that deep sense of responsibility to those who will never get it? How do I explain what it means and what it feels like to hear the ancestors speak to me, to hear their words breathe into song, into dance? How do I explain that when it's all stripped away? How do I allow them to feel as I do? How do I allow them to feel as the trees and the land and the ocean feels, and to appreciate them not because of their beauty, but because they're so much part of our family tree? How do I do that? Because that's, storytelling for me is how we shift minds and how we shift hearts. And that's the Pacific's answer. It has always been the answer, is through our stories. And for me, storytelling doesn't begin with once upon a time and ends with happily ever after. For me, storytelling is when the mat is folded open, when I see the kaupo, the dancer, bow, when I hear the tap of the tattoo, when I hear the birds sing, when I see my elders sweep. That's what storytelling looks like and means to me. And storytelling has such a beautiful way of shifting minds and shifting hearts. And although this story may not be in the tongue that I speak, it is a story of success as well. And so I'm here by choice, but I'm also here by necessity. For too long, our people have been seen as victims of climate change. And by necessity, we know that we are the leaders in this space. From the depths of the Mariana Trench to the highlands of Papua New Guinea, across the river systems of Viti Levu, outside the reefs of my villages in Savai'i, and here on the banks of the river, we know that Indigenous people have the answers. They always have had the answers. We've just never been heard. And so for me, I want to invite you into what I call high-level speak, which is community speak, and share with you a proverb that I carry deeply with me in this space. And it's a Samoan proverb, and it goes, "E fofo e lalamea le alamea." And it speaks of the crown of thorns starfish. And for those of you who know what I'm talking about, it's a very prickly-like creature in the ocean. And it's said among Samoan fishermen that if you are to step on the alamea, the crown of thorns starfish, it will inject a poison into your foot. It's quite painful. But if you were to flip the ala mea, it has a spongy-like back or spongy-like feet. And if you press your wound against that sponge-like feet, the ala mea, or the crown of thorns starfish, will heal its own doing. And it's a proverb that we use to teach and to understand two things: that healing takes action and action takes healing, and that the challenges that are faced by any one community are best solved by that community. And for me, in many ways, Australia and the addiction they have to extraction, Australia is the ala mea. And it's time for Australia to flip and to heal its own doing, because the Pacific are already doing that. And so we're talking about, COP31 coming to Australia in partnership with the Pacific. And for me, that means Australia needs to be a true climate leader. It's fossil fuels or us. And for me, that answer is very clear. And we continue to come to the forefront, to come to the global stage, and to keep echoing what our ancestors have echoed many, 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 many years ago, because we don't have the time. And so, for me, I really hope that this time is a time where we see that ala mea being flipped and we begin to heal together. And so I want to leave you lastly, and I know Susan has heard this many times, but one of my most favourite quotes from Brianna Fruin, who is a climate activist in Samoa, and she says that true climate leadership is like weaving a fala, or a mat, knowing that you may never sit on that mat, but being content in knowing that your children and your children's children will. And that is what true climate leadership looks like to me and to us. So whawhitai lava, thank you. And I look forward to sharing space with you after.
Mary, everyone. Amazing, right? We asked Mary part of this book is partly about the book itself, an act of academic truth-telling, to say, what if, what the forward is actually by our wonderful leader, Dame Meg Taylor, who was the Secretary of the Pacific Island Forum. She came to our first writing workshop for this book and pretty much yelled at us for a while, in a beautiful way, explaining to us that, most Australians' perceptions of the Pacific are completely wrong, and she invited us to flip our thinking, like flipping the starfish, to say, what if they're not small island states, and what if they're big ocean guardians? What if the blue Pacific is a site of considerable power and scope and scale? It's about the way we think about the dark emu. In First Nations people see the darkness between the stars. That's how they guide, that's how they tell stories. They think about the blackness between the stars, whereas we navigate by the starlight. It's about changing our worldview. Climate justice is about flipping everything that we thought we knew, where it's not serving the rights and interests of present and future generations. So there's a lot about us that has to change in our way of thinking. So part of the modelling of this book was also to sort of really partner properly, academically, intellectually, in every way, with our Pacific colleagues. So, there's some real bravery here. Our beautiful departed friend, Brendan Sargent, who's also, the book is dedicated to, actually died before the book came out. He was a Deputy Secretary of Defence. He was the first one to say, what if climate risk was the biggest strategic defence risk to Australia? And he suffered, I think, as a result. What if it's not China? What if it's climate change? He was one of the first to really raise that. And that's what his book is about strategic narratives. And since he died, he was actively lobbying very hard for a climate security risk assessment to be conducted by the Australian government. Unfortunately, it didn't happen in his lifetime, but it has happened since. And unfortunately, it has not been released. And we think that's because it's pretty bad, right? So I was just at the National Security Conference in Canberra asking colleagues in the ONI, when are they going to release a declassified version of that? And they said, never. And I thought, well, look, this is ridiculous. We have to start having honest conversations about what is the risk to Australia's national security, that of our neighbours. But yeah, so the book itself is trying to flip our thinking, flip our way of practice, and challenge us as academics to practice differently as well in the way we do research. And so one of the reasons I'm so honoured to have Mary here is because Mary really typifies to me the type of academic we're trying to be. This is my beautiful daughter, everyone. It's okay. Don't look at her. Don't look at her. It's embarrassing. It's time for questions. We would be very grateful if people had questions. Yes.
Well, thank you for all the panel for that start of the discussion. Look, I want to continue to get your ideas on this issue of sustaining the leadership or maintaining the rage, if I use that term, because as you know far better than I, the small island nations often face a real dilemma of it's the same people who are needing to argue about climate change. It's the same people who are needing to argue about defence engagements. The same people who are talking about legal reform. It's the same people talking about trade issues and employment issues and that sort of thing. And that is very difficult given small bases. So what is the discussion about how we utilise the energy that is there in a way that is going to be sustainable, so that the leadership in continuing to push for climate action can be maintained.
Well, I'll come to Tess on this one, I think.
Okay. So, I think it's a valid point that you make, particularly in small countries that often just the number of available people is limited. And I get very cross when people say to me, there's no capacity in the Pacific. And I say, no, there's lots of capacity. It's just that everybody's really busy and they don't have any spare time. I think we've seen a couple of things happen in recent times which indicate where there may be opportunities to sort of underpin and sustain leadership. One is in the development of a group that's called the Pacific Elders' Voice, of which Dame Meg Taylor is a member, as is former Kiribati President Anote Tong and Elisa Pawanga, again, former leader of Tuvalu. So these are kind of like the elder statesmen and women of the region. They've made a number of significant interventions to the region, to Australia, not just about climate change, but certainly made some very trenchant statements about climate change and what they want to see from Australia or from the global community. So I think, there's definitely scope there to create a kind of an emeritus class, if you like, of people that have great skills, great experience working in international arenas, being involved in negotiations. They carry with them a great deal of mana by virtue of their age and wisdom and their experience, and they've still got a lot to give. So I think that's one aspect. And then the other one kind of almost comes at the other end of the scale and comes back to the point that Sue mentioned about the students that kicked off this whole campaign to get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. And I I have a really emotional connection with this because I taught law at USP, so I can kind of almost imagine the room that they must have been sitting in. But in a lot of Pacific cultures, and Mary, you may want to talk to this as well, for young people to have a voice and to be taken seriously and to be invited into the Nakamal or invited into decision-making spaces is not easily done. In some parts of the Pacific, and it does vary, you might have to be in your mid-30s before you're considered to be sufficiently mature to be consulted or to be asked to be involved. So the fact that these students, there's a whole bunch of things that have been achieved, but I think the key one was that they got the government of Vanuatu to take them seriously, and they got the government of Vanuatu to take on this thing. So that's that's actually a really significant development for a group of young people, not yet in official workforce, not yet mature in cultural terms, to be able to persuade a national government to take on this role. So I think that's something that I hope that other young activists in the Pacific, working whether with Mary's organisation or with others, will be able to look to and see we can get things started. We can get the ball rolling. We might not be in the ICJ when the decision's handed down, but we can make a start, and we can use what our own networks and our own energy to get our leaders to take these conversations on.
I'll come to Mary, but I just want to say, if we think about your question a little bit differently, Australia in the past has opened up embassies, spaces to our Pacific colleagues in New York in particular, in the UN New York, and in Geneva. But during a lot of these climate debates, we were actively working against their interests. So we spent basically 10 years shutting down the influence of most of the diplomatic efforts of our region. I'm not proud of that, and it's very well evidenced, even on this ICJ decision. So, I mean, the easy way to amplify the experience and precious leadership of our Pacific neighbours would be stop trying to stymie them at every turn. That would have been nice, I think, Wes. But where we have kind of got behind and amplified that leadership, it has been quite effective. So, you know, where there has been an alignment more recently, and that's why we tried to be a bit happy. There has been some movement under Penny Wong on this area, but it's about that idea of what if we're the problem? What if actually you don't need a huge population if you've got the right ideas and the right arguments, but what you do need is support. And that's been the part that's been difficult. And Mr. Rudd did support Paris. Copenhagen. But after that, it all kind of fell apart, and we kind of actively working against the leadership of the Pacific, and saying really derogatory remarks, you know, and kind of not behaving as a neighbour should. New Zealand's been better, frankly, at every turn. But, you know, it also means that the Europeans got behind our Pacific leaders when we didn't. It's why China at least is seen as a respectful partner sometimes when we're not, you know. So it's about a respectful relationship as well. We don't always have to agree with our Pacific colleagues, but we have to treat their ideas with respect, and respect that it might actually be a valid argument. That's the bit that we're really arguing about in this book. In our view, it is a very valid argument.
Can I just jump in there? Sorry, Mary, but because I kind of forgot to get to a part of what I wanted to say, in that the Pacific has been leaders in the global discussion on climate change, and Australia has nakedly not been. So, you know, it was really fascinating. In the late 80s and early 90s, Australia and the Pacific were actually pretty aligned. At the time, Gareth Evans was the Australian Foreign Minister, and Australia set pretty ambitious targets to cut emissions early on. And then in the mid-90s, there was a reassessment of Australia's national interests with this idea that, oh, hang on, we're major exporters of coal, growing exporters of gas, and you know, there was this idea that taking action on climate change would unfairly penalise Australia because Australia is a fossil fuel economy, or fossil fuels are a significant part of the economy. But, like, it was a fundamentally wrong reading of Australia's interests on a warming planet, right? You're pumping out as much coal and gas as you can before it's no longer, you know, before you're allowed to. It's like selling as much asbestos as you can. Or it's not what our interests are. And I think, you know, you're exactly right that it's not just guns and treasure that is power in a global climate discussion. It's also if you have the right ideas and if you prosecute them. And the Pacific has. So the Pacific has stuck to the science and says, you know, the global scientific community says if we don't take action, then there are going to be consequences. And, you know, I'm seeing people displaced from their homes by the consequences of climate change in northern New South Wales, in Queensland. There are people where I live who are living in pods because they haven't been able to move home since the floods in 2022. And, it's climate change is... Anyway, the point is that Pacific, Australia mucked it up for a long time, and it really undercut Australia's relations with the Pacific. So periodically, this would come to the fore at leaders' meetings. There would be a shit fight on what the regional position should be in the global climate talks. And that happened in Tuvalu in 2019, and it really ruptured the relationship between Australia and the Pacific. And this government is hoping to repair the relationship in part by hosting the world's climate talks. And that's a big deal. Like the UN climate talks, the last ones last year, Mary was there, along with about 80,000 other people. It's a very big
huge
global event. And if we are to host it, and if we are to host it with the Pacific, we need to rise to the occasion, and we need to revisit that calculation in the mid-90s of what Australia's national interests are. And in fact, our national interests are the same as the Pacific Islands. We need to see global action on climate change as fast as possible. And Australia's economic interests are also lining up with that. So, but it's an open question as to whether or not Australia will rise to the occasion. We could muck that up too.
And it might be held here in Brisbane, COP31. So we have a lot on the line. This community right here has a lot on the line with this discussion. Mary, over to you. Gosh, look at that.
That's okay. I just want to speak on your point, Tess, about young people. COP last year was my first ever COP, and I was astounded by, is that the right word, astounded? Amazed, by the amount of young people who were in negotiations. We're seeing Pacific governments invest in their young people as negotiators. We don't see that from Australia. And it was unfortunate that I was there on Australian badge, so I was left out of rooms, rightly so. But there is so much youth leadership in the Pacific. And, we see the tides are changing, and I say that in a metaphorical sense and a realistic sense. And our young people come in with so much creativity and innovation, but also with a wealth of knowledge because they've been blessed by their old people to stand there and speak. Because we know that it's time. We need to think differently. We need to flip the way we've done things. And yes, that does sometimes start fires in terms of cultural protocol. But I think we're seeing a new wave of what that cultural protocol looks like in the political sense for our nations, which is really exciting. Thank you for your question.
Mary, I've just been thinking about what you were talking about for your segment, particularly about storytelling for activism, because I'm an artist too, and I look at this through the lens of filmmaking, because I have a lot of discussions with my mom about activism and how to work through it and use it effectively for this younger generation that's coming into activism. And I was just wondering what your perspective was on how do we, break this kind of generational gap between this younger generation that's trying to come in and, join in the conversation and help with the conversation, trying to bring in new ideas, and the older generation that has, their own ideas and they've been involved in it for such a long time that they've become, immersed in it. And how do we break through it, particularly through the lens of storytelling and, trading perspectives on it?
Great question. And also you have a great mom. So that's pretty cool. Yes, I face this challenge myself. Again, we have cultural protocol, which means there are spaces, that are for our elders, and there are spaces for our youth, and there are some spaces where the two generations dialogue, right? And I think that's also one of the powers of storytelling, right? It fills the var or the gap, and the gap isn't empty. Similar to how the darkness between stars, it's not empty. And so, for us as Samoans, we have, I won't go through the whole the saying, but when you're invited to an event, you don't sit at the head table. You sit amongst the people and you learn. until you're invited to that table. And that's not about silencing you. It's about giving you the space to learn, to listen, and it's the respect part. And I know that looks different in different cultures, in different spaces, especially in Australia when things are happening so much and we have our young people who are firing up and they want to go on the streets and they want to do, amazing stuff, which we love. But it's a really, really tough question. So I don't know if I'm answering it correctly, but I would probably encourage you to keep going with that storytelling because film is so important in how we fill or nurture that gap. And I think it's a question a lot of people have been asking. And it's not just around climate, it's also just about life. How do we talk to our old people about issues that we're facing now that they just don't get? And then how do they talk to us about how they, walked thousands of miles to school when it was only just down the road? And we don't understand that. So there's always going to be, this gap. But I encourage you to keep going with the storytelling because I'm keen to have a yarn with you after about, maybe what that looks like moving forward.
Yep. I think we've come to the end of our time. Are we allowed to have one more? Yes.
Yes, I was surprised recently to learn that Australia has a climate change ambassador.
Yes.
And I haven't seen that person on any of the news channels, outlining any of the government policies. I just wonder what their role is.
Well, lucky for you, there's a whole chapter on the climate change ambassador in here by our wonderful colleague Caitlin Byrne. And it's really about, it's no reflection on Kristen Tilley, who is the current ambassador for climate change. But when we were the first country in the whole world to have an environment ambassador, and guess who we started with? Sir Ninian Stephen, who went Governor General, High Court Judge, absolute legend, Sir Ninian Stephen. He was the most senior Australian, basically. So this is after he'd finished being Governor General, after he'd finished being a High Court Judge. We appointed him Environment Ambassador, and he was the first one in the world. And because he was of that status, he had a protocol, which he was basically a head of state still, or a retired head of state. So our first Environment Ambassador went everywhere, saw everyone was treated, received by heads of state. Caitlin's chapter sort of shows how over the years that an Environment Ambassador has moved down the pecking order in terms of the types of people that have been appointed. So the next, there was a very effective ambassador that you might know because her name is Penny Wensley and she was the Governor of Queensland. So she came after Sir Ninian. Kristen is a bureaucrat and an advisor. She's a very savvy negotiator. So she worked for Greg Combay for a long time and she helped to set up the Department of Climate Change in the previous Gillard government. But she's what you'd call a behind-the-scenes negotiator. That's probably quite important in the sense of she's probably quite effective at a COP. I would defer to your opinion. But it doesn't mean that she has the same clout as someone like Sir Ninian Stephen. So it's a question of the way we shape our foreign policy displays our values, right? So we want to think about what does it mean to have an ambassador for climate change when one part of your government is still approving coal mines on this pretty rapid basis? And, how does that mean that person has the type of authority to do what they need to do? So it's called an unenviable appointment. And then I sent her the book and then went, oh man, I forgot what it was called. Here's a chapter about you and your unenviable appointment. But I think that chapter does show you that we did, as Wes said, we started high and we kind of then went, and now we're coming up again, but we're still kind of not where we need to be. So if you think about the US equivalent, John Kerry, I think he's just about to retire or has just stepped down. But, think about the clout he has. So you make choices in who you get to embody your state in particular spaces. Yeah.
But there's a quote here from the current Australian Climate Minister, Bowen, and he talks about how, in this quote, he talks about how Pacific interests and Australian interests are starting to align, not just with regards to we're all being impacted by climate change, But Australia's economic interests are shifting as well. You know, there's an acknowledgement by this government that we can't just keep exporting coal and gas forever. They are very reluctant to stop approving new coal and gas, but they are also out there. Albanese today was talking about a new
I was at lunch
future
with the
made
PM
in
today.
Australia.
Yeah, future made in Australia, and it's all clean and it's all green.
Yeah, but I mean, it's fascinating. There is a hard-headed acknowledgement that the future economy will be one that's wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles. You know, solar technologies, fossil technologies are legacy technologies. They're on their way out. And this federal government has started to realise that Australia needs to manage that transition well. And so the climate ambassador, their role will shift as well, I think.
I hope so, yes. So Albanese today, if you didn't catch it, he announced a Future Made in Australia bill, which is going to be a lot like the Inflation Reduction Bill in the US. So it's actually like strategic investments. It's a move a bit away from a very open economy into a kind of a strategic government investment into really kickstart some particular types of things, including green energy. So if you've been following the Biden administration, it's a huge amount of money into that energy transition. So interesting development today, but we haven't seen the legislation yet. He just announced that it will happen today, and there was a lot of kind of like, what does that mean? But in the US, it's been really significant.
Okay, Tyrone, it's all yours.
That's okay. I knew this panel was going to go over time, but it's important. Thank you very much. My name's Tyrone Nagesh. I'm Curatorial Manager of Asian and Pacific Art here at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery Modern Art. On behalf of the gallery and the staff here, it's my pleasure to offer a very brief vote of thanks. I won't be long at all. Firstly, to our panel, a stellar cast from Griffith University tonight. Certainly an indication of the expertise we have right here in Brisbane, and very lucky to have the Pacific Hub and Griffith Asia Institute here, and long-term collaborators with us, but also we have the privilege of accessing their knowledge so regularly. And also, along with Mary tonight, who's also collaborated with us a number of here, bringing some very kind of memorable and impactful programs and community engagement strategies to the gallery and to some of our art projects. And I think also just signals the centrality of activism in kind of everything we do on an issue like this. Mary, Sue, Wesley and Tess, thank you for taking the time to prepare tonight, although you clearly didn't have to prepare because you know this stuff pretty well, I think. Not only to draw attention to this issue, but also sharing so much expertise of the region as well. I had the incredible embarrassment before this panel of trying to walk these four people through a Pacific art show, to my undying shame. But they were very kind, so thank you. I think you've also brought to our attention the incredible leadership and capacity that is in the Pacific. In a way, there's kind of this, in a way it turns this issue into, we kind of see optimism shine through this issue until we get to talking about Australia, and then that optimism kind of bursts. But I think leadership, I think the role of storytelling, is so important to think about as well. I know so much of the artwork we show here, and the artists we work with, and the storytellers we work with, these are insights, these are voices, these are issues that you can't disconnect from their practice, like you can't disconnect the forms of activism, the forms of cultural knowledge and cultural practice from these, and it really shines through how central they are to all of our lives. Congratulations to you all on the book as well. Do read it. I don't need to sell it now after you've spoken so well about it. And thanks for also your generosity in fielding all the questions tonight. A very warm thank you to our partners in the long-running Perspectives Asia series. We're already hatching plans of how we're going to celebrate the 20th anniversary next year. Big thanks to Christoph, who for welcoming us tonight. Christoph was also spoke at a lunch event today as a stand-in for someone who cancelled last minute. So he's actually spoken at 2 events today. That was on China's green energy, and Australia didn't look too good in that relationship either. Thank you to the Griffith Asia Institute team, and finally thank you to our audience for coming tonight and sharing in these great discussions. We're just hatching plans for the mid-year Perspectives Asia, and I think we're almost there, and it should be a really exciting speaker and topic. So please stay tuned, subscribe to Griffith Asia Institute, and look out for the program that will be announced shortly. Thank you again to our panel. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks.